Okay. So here, just I would like to make a few observations regarding this old connections of the Jewish community in India. Yesterday, we had one speaker, Oshrit Borvidkar. So her last name, Borvidkar, is a typical Maharashtrian surname, and she came from that old Jewish settlements in Maharashtra. So that's something of a particular interest to me. And another point which yes, Dalia made about the Ikhwan and the Muslim Brotherhood. Certainly, I would agree with you, Dalia, because I have worked on terrorism, and certainly Ikhwan, and especially Muslim Brotherhood, they're trying to make strong inroads in India, particularly in Kashmir and Kerala. They're trying to reach out to the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is another radical Islamist organization in Kashmir and funded by and sponsored by Pakistan. So they are trying to reach out to them. And these connections are not new. They are like old connections. So if we, because of so in my research, I had a chance to look at the charge sheet and the interrogation reports of Masood Azhar, who is currently the head of Jaish-e-Mohammed, another Pak-sponsored terrorist group. And he says that even back in 1990s, that when he visited UAE and Saudi Arabia for fundraising, he found it extremely difficult because UAE and Saudi Arabia, they said that, well, we have good relationship with India, so we cannot give you money. But then, yes, he raised a lot of money from the Deobandi network in Britain, UK, and from South Africa and other African countries. So these connections are quite old. And then, yes, another question that comes to my mind is that, it's a very fundamental question which follows from this discussion, that if an extremist organization like Muslim Brotherhood is able to carve out a strong base among the common people and is in the position to democratically occupy or reach into the power, should that be acceptable? That's a big question because in Turkey, Erdogan, he came through the democratic channel, but then the Erdogan's regime has strong ties with the ISIS, and the Sadat paramilitary group is trying to create unrest in many different countries. Okay.
Yeah,
Many different countries. Please mute, I guess. Please, just, I think.
Just a minute.
Yeah. So yes, so that's a very fundamental question, and I'll be speaking more about the Muslim Brotherhood outreach in India and terror radicalization in our next session, which is on terrorism. And we have General Hasnain, who's going to chair the next session. He's here. He's needs no introduction. He's one of the finest speaker and thinker on strategic military and foreign policy issues in India these days. He has served as the corps commander in Kashmir, and he has hands-on experience dealing with the terrorism. And we have, so I'll just hand it over to him to introduce the speakers in this session. Over to you, General Hasnain.
Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you very much. Am I audible, first of all?
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much. I peeped into the last session. I was there for about 20 minutes or so. Thank you so much. It was fascinating. Always great to see here Ambassador Anil Trigunath, and this panel was absolutely outstanding. Compliments to the previous panel, and similarly to all the panels. This whole idea of this seminar very, very timely, and the subject itself was just what one was seeking at this particular moment. So we are into the last session of this moment, and I thought that perhaps people have forgotten about global terror by now, because a lot is being written to say that the cycle of global terror is over. We can await the next cycle, because this comes in cycles from time to time. The first cycle, to my mind, was the post-World War II era, in which it was not so much ideological terrorism, it was more based upon political terrorism. It was not so vicious in nature. It was very debatable. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was labeled as a terrorist organization. Was it really one or not? Was Yasser Arafat a terrorist? Or things like that, issues of that kind emerged from that period. And subsequently came a second phase, pre-2000, pre-9/11. And that was now veering towards the ideological side. And you found that from 77 onwards, particularly in the subcontinent, there had been attempts to try and bring about a very, very radical kind of an ideology father of it was, of course, Ziaul Haq in Pakistan. The war in Afghanistan had given it a spurt. The events of 1979 had given it a particular spurt at that particular time. India and Israel were two countries which were at the receiving end, largely at the receiving end, and much of the world was really not concerned at that much. Subsequently came the third cycle. And this is my own sort of division into cycles. This is not something which is acceptable internationally. But then came the third cycle. And that was post 9/11. When the world took shape, took cognizance of it, because the United States had been hit, the world took cognizance of it. Repeatedly, Europe was hit, Southeast Asia was hit. India, of course, continued to remain at the center of it. And then then of course came within the third phase itself a very, very vicious phase in 2014 onwards with the coming of ISIS, which was a different form of terrorism, radical and extremist to the hilt completely, and with a greatly sophisticated element of information management, motivation, the use of networks, use of finances, the ability to attract 40,000 global fighters to come and fight on behalf of ISIS, not something which was very easy, but this was all done by them. Fortunately, they were virtually defeated, not completely defeated, virtually defeated by 2018, Mosul and places like that, and are now in virtual state. And we are finding that the pandemic perhaps affected it all, and the third phase came to a near end. And today, the Ukraine war, post-COVID, the post-pandemic environment where recovery, etc., is now taking all the focus, you find that terrorism has raised its head in different areas, but not in the manner in which it did in the early part of the third cycle, or even the parts of the second cycle. And is a lot is waiting to happen. Afghanistan, for example, vacant spaces in Afghanistan occupied by international terrorist groups. Southeast Asia is quiet. Africa seems to be reasonably quiet. Central Asia is quiet. The Middle East is reawakening all of a sudden, and too much of attention is still going on to East Europe with the Ukrainian war. In India, fortunate, from 2014, we really haven't suffered anything. Even prior to that, we have not suffered for some time any major strikes as such, except Jammu and Kashmir, which remains a proxy war, terror proxy war launched by our adversaries and neighbors. With that, I expect that we will discuss the coming fourth cycle of global terror, which to a lot of scholars is an inevitable thing. This is something which, as soon as the pandemic gets, as the effects of the pandemic get over, the world recovers once again. Economically, you will find all this returning. And Afghanistan seems to be the core center. You're seeing Pakistan and a very new phenomenon which is emerging, and that is climate change and terrorism. You see what's happening in Pakistan. Poverty-stricken populations, not to say that poverty is always connected to terror, but terror and poverty do go along with each other. There's the creation of poverty-stricken populations. Very unfortunate what's happening in Turkey and Syria today. We are seeing on the Syrian-Turkish border today, 17,000 fatal casualties and rising. These are the kind of areas which have the potential to be able to provide. And that's the place which we have to be careful about, where people are going to go. You're going to find international terrorist recruiters going. And with the networks available today, with electronic networks available today, so much easier to be able to attract people, train them, motivate them, and launch them as terrorists. So this is what we are primarily looking at in this phase. Where do we stand today? Where are we going? And we've got a very, very strong panel for this. We've got Mr. Michael Rubin with us, scholar from the American Enterprise Institute and senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School, and an author. I presume when you say a senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School, it does, this is the is at the Monterey Bay. I suppose you may like to confirm it once your intervention comes up. And then there's, of course, Abhinav himself, Abhinav Pandya, the founder and CEO of the Usanas Foundation, and the author of Radicalization in India and Exploration. And then we have Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi. Very good to see an official coming on board and speaking in a seminar of this nature. Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi is the member of the Indian Foreign Service, serves as a Joint Secretary for Counterterrorism with the Ministry of External Affairs. And lastly, we have got Dr. Michael Barak. He is a senior researcher and lecturer at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the Reichman University and a scholar at the Middle Eastern and African Studies Department of the Tel Aviv University. So you can see to round off this seminar, we have an excellent panel. I shall, of course, keep intervening in the middle to give 1 minute kind of summaries of what speakers have spoken, the directions that they have taken in their interventions through this. Abhinav, I'm not sure how much time do we really have for this. By what time do we have to end?
So 15 minutes each speaker, and then after that about 20 minutes for the Q&A session.
For the Q&A session. So I think we should be able to end up at about one, a little bit beyond one,
Yes.
1:10 or so. Well, that's adequate time. And I'm sure all our speakers are going to be very disciplined as far as their timings are concerned. So if we start with Dr. Michael Rubin, the scholar, he's scholar of the American Enterprise Institute and a senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School and also an author. Over to you, sir, and looking forward to your intervention. 15 minutes. I shall warn you at about 13 minutes, sir.
Thank you so much, General. Thank you for having me. I want to thank the organization for putting this together. I always look forward to these conferences, especially from the Usanas Foundation. At any rate, I just want, in addressing India and as it relates to the war on terror, I'm going to, of course, talk a little bit about India, but I'm going to do so from an American policy perspective as we look at this problem. The first thing we need is simply moral clarity. When we talk about the terror problem as India faces it, we need to recognize that terror is imposed on India. Recently, I had the opportunity to travel through Kashmir and Jammu, to go to Pulwama, to go to southern Kashmir and so forth. And even though in the last few months there's been a few episodes, what, broadly speaking, Kashmir's recovery shows the fallacy of the terror narrative that for too long was accepted at face value in the United States, in the West, and elsewhere. The fact of the matter is, in Srinagar, you see a new life as students are able to compete without having to worry about schools being closed. Cinemas are opening. This notion that Kashmir was a repressive situation has simply been proven to be nonsense. This creates a real difficulty, if you will, given how much Pakistan has invested in that Kashmir narrative. The fact of the matter is, Kashmir Indian Kashmir is now outperforming Pakistani occupied Kashmir in a way that completely delegitimizes the Pakistani narrative. What I worry about as we go forward, however, is the danger that outside forces will try a plan B. Specifically, we already see the groundwork for this being laid with the so-called Khalistan movement. And as with the Kashmir movement initially, there's a great deal of naivete in both the United States and Canada with regard to this. We need to recognize that few of these violent movements, few of these militant movements are truly indigenous in nature. Oftentimes, it's external actors who are pouring fuel on the fire. And both the diplomatic narratives that we hold in the United States, the media narratives have to be much more aware of the nuance and the reality of what we're seeing. We need to be reminded as Americans specifically that the root of terrorism India faces is ideological and not based in grievance. I would argue the same thing holds true with regard to Israel and so forth. Diplomats, at least in the United States and Washington, too often want to look at terrorism as rooted in grievance because that's almost comforting. If terrorism is rooted in grievance more than ideology, then you can come up with some diplomatic bargain to to address it, to resolve it. But the fact of the matter is, when it's ideological, it can be much more difficult to root out. And we have to calibrate our policy to reality rather than to wishful thinking. I would argue that the United States has some policy deficits which impact India's fight against terrorism as well as our own. And I highlight this. I'm not trying to bash Washington, but as Washington continues to develop its relationship with New Delhi, as we hope to have the Quad evolve into something perhaps a little bit more, it's imperative that we not look at India as any sort of junior partner to American interests, but recognize that India is an equal and that we need to understand India's narrative and the fight that India faces. Along this lines, the fact that the United States doesn't truly hold Pakistan to account for the murder of American citizens in the Mumbai attacks projects weakness that I'm not sure that many American diplomats realize. In an American sense of history, ancient history is 10 years ago. In the State Department, people rotate every 2 years or so. And so this institutional memory simply doesn't exist in Washington. That said, it certainly exists in Islamabad and in Pindi. There's an old Russian joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who says, things have never been so bad. War, violence, environment, economy, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, they can always get worse. So for a second, I'm going to give a little bit of an optimistic statement in that spirit. I worry a great deal about the failure of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Pakistan placed a great deal of its hopes that somehow this would be, to use an American football analogy, a Hail Mary pass that could somehow rescue its economy. It would be a last-minute goal, I guess, if you want to do real football. At any rate, the fact that this has not delivered, the fact that Pakistan finds itself tens of billions of dollars in debt because of this, means that the Pakistani government, and specifically the forces who operate behind the Pakistani government, are going to be looking to distract their public from their own failures, the failures of the last two Pakistani administrations. And to me, I circle back to some of the problems that we've seen in Kashmir even quite recently, but more broadly, the Khalistan movement. And I worry that Pakistan is going to really try to fan the flames of terrorism as we move forward. Let me just conclude by saying that we need to understand that democracies, even imperfect democracies, and I would include both our countries in that, they must have solidarity. They face common threats. And we have to recognize and show true solidarity in facing those common threats. It's not fair for the United States to expect India to take our side when it comes to issues of our interpretations of terrorism if we're going to continue to ignore the terror concerns of the world's largest democracy. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I would hope that with some gentle reminders and some moral clarity, the United States can do much more to side much more firmly with the democracies and recognize that Pakistan's problem is ideological. It's not something that can be addressed by bribery, by giving new F-16s or any other packages. That only encourages further terrorism. So with that, let me turn the floor back over.
Sorry, you've taken just 8 minutes, actually. If you wish to add anything further, you have all the time, if you wish to.
Actually, I prefer brevity in this case because I think the meat of the discussion will be
very nice. I'm glad to be attending a seminar where we have a speaker who actually believes in brevity. Wonderful. I've rarely come across that kind of a thing anyway. Thank you so
Well,
much.
maybe also because it's 1:20 in the morning here, so I have an incentive to be brief.
Possible, absolutely. But we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. We feel that you must be having a very, very sharp and organized mind to be able to put across all this in just about 8 minutes. But having said that, let me take 2 minutes of your time and summarize. I think it was an excellent intervention. I'm glad you visited Kashmir, and I'm glad you visited some of my areas where I was earlier. The Colonel General Staff, I was looking after Pulwama, Shupia, and those areas. I'm glad you went past them or at least visited some of them. And I spent a fairly long time in every appointment almost in Kashmir. So your observations are spot on. Things have changed drastically. But as I said, the next cycle of global terror, and this need not be linked to global terror alone, it can be, of course, standalone. The issue of Khalistan, the terrorists, the Khalistan terrorists, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in Punjab itself, attempts to link Punjab with Kashmir, Kathua, this area of Jammu, Kathua area with Punjab, and the recent flurry of events we have seen in the Jammu sector, all this is causing bits of concern. So I'm glad that you have observed almost exactly the same. The importance of democracies coming together, and the importance of understanding that Pakistan's terror is ideological. Absolutely. If you remember in the beginning, I spoke about political terror and I spoke about ideological terror. This is ideological terror. Any amount of, you may give out doles, you may give out anything, X-16 packages, etc. But unless you address the core issue of ideological issues, you are not going to resolve this issue. And Pakistan is, of course, in the middle of a major challenge because of what's happening today with this economy. The kind of implosion which is taking place could potentially take place at any time in the near future. Although I do feel very strongly that the United States and the Western world will ensure that Pakistan does not collapse, because Pakistan's geostrategic location is such which no one would like to see a complete turbulence in this area, least of all us in India. We may not be able to manage the kind of effects of that kind of turbulence which may come about from implosion. Reminding the rest of the attendees in this seminar that implosion, what is the effect of implosion? 24 million with the population of Syria. When it imploded, the effect of it went as far as the United States, the UK, Spain, into Belgium, into Turkey. And now you're finding Syria in the throes of a major problem because at the earthquake affected areas, no one can address those areas today because of the problems of security there itself. So these are some of the interesting observations. Thank you for making all those points, and we'll come back to you, I'm sure, with some Q&A. Although I know it's 1:30 at night, we're not going to still let you go, but we would like to pick your brain at this time of the night too. So may I now request our second speaker, Abhinav himself, to come up and make his intervention, 15 minutes or so, whatever you would like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Hasnain. Dr. Rubin has already set the standards of brevity, but for me, it'll be very difficult to match up to them. But I'll try to finish my part, in 15 minutes. I feel that India has been a major victim of terrorism since 1990s, though it started back in 1980s only, but from 1990, it has been a major problem. And it was long before the September 11 attacks, which kind of shook the world, out of this slumber, and the world started, commenced this global war on terror. So our fight against terror has primarily been on three fronts. First is the terror financing, ideological, the radicalization, and third, the counter-terror operations. So as far as terrorism in Kashmir is concerned, so in Kashmir, initially the terror financing began when the Pakistan initially started. They never thought that they would get this kind of warm response from Kashmir. Initially, they thought that at the max about 100, 200 boys would cross over and that will be fine. But when they realized that people were coming in droves, about thousands of people were coming for the training, and then they thought that it's a time to make it a more systematic venture. and they began this organization Hurriyat, and so about 26 different separatist parties came up, and all of them had their own militant chapters, militant wings. So in those days, it used to be said that it was very easy to get into Pakistan and just get a terrorist organization registered in your name and come back, get one receipt and come back to Kashmir. People would log grenades for petty amounts like 20 rupees. So it was getting that formal shape. Initially, they started this terror funding business through cash transfers, and they would carry most of the militants who infiltrated into India. They would carry cash up to 10 lakhs, 15 lakhs. Each group had around 50 to 20 lakhs, or sometimes even less. Okay? And then 1996 onwards, they started exploring other different ways. So Hawala became a very significant and a very crucial method for transferring terror funds 1996 onwards. Then the government of India started launching crackdown against Hawala. And this, the Hawala, interestingly, it can be seen that when Hawala became the main, the backbone of terror funding and the transferring of terror funds in Kashmir, it also coincided with the launching of the foreign terrorist groups in Kashmir, like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. And at the same time, Taliban had also come to power in Afghanistan. So all these things facilitated facilitated the linkages of Kashmir-centric terror groups with the global terrorism. After 2001, the government had already become a little more serious about Hawala by 2000. So after 2001, Pakistan started exploring other different options for terror funding, among which the prominent ones were the medical seats, selling medical seats for raising terror funds, in which basically they started offering medical seats in Pakistan and engineering seats in Pakistan to the kith and kin of deceased militants in Kashmir. And in return, the money was paid to the Hurriyat leaders in Kashmir, which was a part of it was kept by the Hurriyat leaders, and a major part of it was given to the terrorist organizations. Then in course of time, this became a very complex and very sophisticated method of raising funds, and they started sending students to other countries also, Central Asian countries and Bangladesh and even some European countries, and these people were placed there. In return, the money was sent to Hurriyat leaders in Kashmir. And the students who visited Pakistan, they were not only used, it wasn't only the money raising channel, but they were also used for other ends and other purposes. Notably, some of them were trained in Pakistan in weapons training. And interestingly, the hybrid militants which we see today in Kashmir, a large number of them are those people who visited Pakistan in 2017 on a valid legal visa for educational purposes, got trained there, and with proper instructions that when they have to activate themselves. So they came back and now they work as hybrid militants. And they were also used to send messages and for the other reasons also. 2007-8 onwards, Pakistan started using the channel of LOC trade for terror funding. Apart from that, there were other channels like Hajj tours and travels for raising money for the terror business, and charity, under invoicing, over invoicing, the conventional methods. But overall, it can be said that Kashmir's terror funding scenario is much more complex and very layered as compared to the global terror funding scenario. So therefore, it has been a big challenge for India. But 2010 onwards, NIA got into action and they have launched a massive crackdown against the terror funding, and the results of that can be seen. I would like to mention that this 2016 post-Burhan Wani agitation, this became a huge, massive unrest across the Kashmir. And the reason for this was that this terror funding machinery was working very smoothly and in a very efficient manner from 2007 to 2016. Huge amounts of money, about 400 crores or something like that. I don't remember the exact figures. I've written them in my book, which will be released soon. They were pumped into Kashmir, and this money was distributed to stone pelters, and there was a big network, very hierarchical system of street coordinators and district coordinators for stone pelting, who would come and disrupt the legitimate counter-terror operations. But post 2016, NIS got into action and they arrested all the big Hurriyat leaders who were working as the main coordinators of the Hawala funds and all this money which came from Pakistan. And after that, we can see the result was seen post 2019 when India abrogated Article 370. There was hardly any resistance. There were no stone pelting protests. There was nothing. So this was because of the major action against the terror funding machinery in Kashmir. Second battle against terror has been against the radical Islamist organizations. In Kashmir, we saw that 1990 onwards, Jamaat-e-Islami played a crucial role in radicalizing the common society because they knew that the Kashmiri society was by temperament a liberal society, and they had followed a very different kind of syncretic Islam in which there were influences of Buddhism, there were influences of Shaivism. So they realized that if they had to sustain the terror business in Kashmir for a longer duration, they would have to invest in radicalizing people. So Jamaat-e-Islami, which basically believes in the ideology of Maulana Maududi and is also considered an intellectual arm of Hizbul Mujahideen, made a big penetration in Kashmir. Although it started long back in 1942, but 1990 onwards, it became a main vehicle for driving terrorism intellectually and ideologically. They destroyed the schools and they became a major support base for Hizbul Mujahideen. They would support people in with welfare schemes and running orphanages, running schools, producing a very radicalized lot of people who would go and join government services, academia, and the banking institutions and support the terror business and the terror movement in an ideological manner. Besides, on the other hand, they supplied people who worked as the overground workers for terrorist organizations. And in the third track, they produce people who would be trained in the Jamaat-e-Islami seminaries, and after some time they would leave the Jamaat-e-Islami seminary and then they would join the terrorist groups. So a major part of terror coordinators, they come from the Jamaat leadership. In 2019, after the Pulwama Fidain attack, Government of India has banned Jamaat-e-Islami. Their premises have been raided, and the results can be seen that today all the terrorist groups are really facing a major survival and existential crisis in Kashmir. Post 2019, we can see that a large number of terror commanders and most of these leaders have been eliminated based on the very fine intelligence-based operations. I must say in that the Jammu and Kashmir police has played a leading role along with the Indian Army, and without the support of Jammu and Kashmir police, it would have been very difficult to eliminate the terrorist groups and terrorist commanders. In Pakistan, as per my recent inputs from my friends, I'm told that Mr. Syed Salahuddin has been shifted to some safe location, and ISI is terribly annoyed with Mr. Syed Salahuddin because they feel that he's of no use. He could not produce any unrest in Kashmir. Hizbul Mujahideen is very reluctant to start and revitalize the movement in Kashmir because they feel that the Indian agencies and the intelligence-based operations are doing a very fine job, and it's very difficult for them to come back again. This is the reason why Pakistan is resorting to hybrid militants phenomena, creating a very sleeper cell kind of a militancy movement which can work as a civilians and which can easily gel well with the people and doesn't require much investment. But at the same time, they are trying to send the foreign militants from the Lashkar group and Jaish groups, and they're trying to settle them in Kashmir. And they want to initiate a civil unrest, a very mass-based civil movement in Kashmir against the government of India, so that there's a huge bloodbath and it creates a major embarrassment for the people, for the government of India. So that is something which is going to be a challenge in the future. So that's why we need to reach out to people in Kashmir. Besides that, in Pakistan, TTP and after the arrival of Taliban in Afghanistan, and especially in the wake of the major TTP attacks in the recent past, it must be highlighted that these people have strong linkages with the establishment in the Pak army. So, in case if that this phenomena increases, if this gains in strength, then this is going to be a major problem because, like Lashkar and or Jaish, they have ready cadre of people in lakhs who are well trained. And if the institutions collapse in Pakistan, be it the army, be it the administration, then it is going to be a major challenge, a security challenge for India. But beyond Kashmir, we have other radical groups in India like PFI, which has been banned recently in India. But then PFI has played a very crucial and a major role in radicalizing the youth across the country. And in the recent past, we saw that in the DGP's conference, in the recent DGP's conference, they said that the radicalization of the young Muslim youth is the major challenge for India. Now, the problem is that it's not just about the terror groups. It's basically about the radicalization at the mass level, these young lot, which is getting radicalized. And then we have a major problem of this weapons coming through drones and infiltration from tunnels in Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir. So if all these things get combined, then it can have a very strong radicalized lot across the country. And if there is any communal incident which can which can escalate into a major communal riot situation or some kind of these terror groups and terrorist coordinators entering into that scenario and killing people, then it can be a major security challenge. Lately, some of these transnational groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda in Indian subcontinent have also made a major headway in the Indian society. Though I agree that, well, from India, very few number of people joined ISIS. But then we also have to look at the things which are happening currently and in the recent past, that the radicalization is certainly going to be a major problem. And we always talk about India becoming or reclaiming its leadership role in the world. But personally, I feel that we have to put our own house in order, and this requires solutions at multiple track. Definitely, at an international level, we need to engage more with Saudi and Saudi Arabia, UAE, for the especially be in the matters of extradition and controlling terror funding. As far as the technological and intelligence side part is concerned, India needs to work with Israel, because certainly they have much advanced technological infrastructure, which can be very helpful in checking the drones and checking the infiltration through tunnels, and also in better intelligence gathering. I'm emphasizing on this intelligence-based approach because the reason is that now, since radicalization is happening at the mass level, any lapse or any error on the part of the law enforcement agencies can create, can end up getting common innocent people involved in this. But if we want to keep the innocent people apart, away from this trap, and we want to target the real culprits and the real coordinators, then I guess we need to have much better intelligence. And in that respect, we need to take help from the countries which are much advanced and also follow their best practices. Particularly, the state intelligence agencies need to be developed very efficiently. Lastly, I would say that Khalistan terror machinery is very active in Canada and England, and these two countries need to shed and abandon their duplicitous stand on these terrorism issues. And definitely, even the Kashmir lobby is quite active, so they need to take action against them. In the US, the global Islamist lobbies like ICNA, Muslim American Society, Kashmir American Council, Kashmir Canadian Council, Indian American Muslim Council. These are the organizations which are properly legal organizations. They work as charities. They also get support from the state in the US, but then they have linkages with the global terrorist groups, be it Hamas or be it Lashkar, be it ISIS or be it Hizbul Mujahideen. And they have been complicit in aiding and facilitating terrorism across the world, and particularly in Jammu and Kashmir. So I think India and US need to collaborate, and these groups play a very strong role in creating a narrative war against India, especially all these notions which we hear today of minorities facing persecution in India and US CRIF getting very strong against India. So US CRIF is strongly influenced by these Islamist lobbies working in the US. And some of the senators, particularly from the Democrat side, they are supporting them. They are just hands in glove with them. So I think we need to call spade a spade, and definitely, India needs to be very firm and clear against this, because this state support, whether it comes from Pakistan or it comes from countries like Qatar, who are supporting, the Islamist charities or the radical groups in India, or if it comes from the groups which are finding safe havens because of the free society in Europe or free society in countries like US, then I think this all needs to be brought in the forefront and discussed, and we need to find solutions. Thank you very much. If I have overshot my time limit, my apologies. Thank you.
No, you haven't overshot your time limit at all. You're well within your time, because we've got enough time as it is, and one of our speakers is not joining in at all. But let me come forward and maybe give one or two comments on some excellent points that you have made. You have focused your presentation primarily on Jammu and Kashmir, no doubt. It is an area of concern. What I will do subsequently is that I take up Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi's place, because he's not, since probably he's not joining us. I'm not sure if he's joined us. No, he's not probably joining us. So I will make some points on his behalf at a subsequent stage. But to comment specifically on what you have brought out, Abhinav, number one, this is experience-based, which I will tell you. It's a very good thing. All these seminars everywhere, we must continue to motivate the Jammu and Kashmir Police. It's the local organization, and it has played an outstanding role. But let me tell you, it's not only now. The Jammu and Kashmir Police, especially the Special Operations Group, SOG. SOG is the main thing in this. It was set up almost 30 years ago. And the Indian Army, the Indian Army has its own intelligence arm, it's got its intelligence sources, etc. But it relies heavily on the local police. And this is a principle the world over. Where it is the local police who can get you that quality intelligence. No one coming from outside for 2 to 3 years is going to be able to get you that kind of intelligence. So the Indian Army and the Jammu and Kashmir are very well integrated, particularly, this is a lesson for everyone, particularly the Rashtra Rifles and the Jammu and Kashmir Police. You see, the Indian Army experimented, I would say India experimented with this concept of the Rashtra Rifles, of bringing in permanent units. People may turn over, personnel turnover, but the unit is there, institution is there permanently in an area forever. Now, there are units which are there since the last 40 years, the last 35 years, I would say. And therefore, they are well integrated with the local police out there. And that is what is the strength of the system. So, it's a very good issue which you triggered, which should have a larger understanding among all of us. Without this integration, if you think that the police can conduct its own operations and the army can conduct its own operations, sorry, this just can't happen in particularly proxy war conditions like the way they exist in Jammu and Kashmir. The second area, which Abhinav did not perhaps comment on so much, is on infiltration. Remember, among the various inputs towards the human resource element, you have local recruitment, you have foreign terrorists infiltrating, you have local terrorists exfiltrating for training and infiltrating back in place again. It is infiltration of leadership from the POK side coming in and going into various towns, etc. So there are lots and lots of ways by which this human resource element is made up. Now, if you bottle off infiltration, one source is closed, and you have strong intelligence on recruitment, you can prevent local recruitment. That's why we always keep counting numbers of local recruits. And you see today, it's come down to a strength of 150, 160 terrorists, even lower than that, perhaps. It's primarily because of this. As a macro level understanding, let me tell you, in the year 2003, General Nirmal Vij, who Abhinav knows, you know very well as being a former Vivekananda International Foundation head also, he was the chief of the army staff and he gave out a direction. He said, let us bring the strength of terrorists in Kashmir to below 1,000. This is Jammu and Kashmir. Can we do this by limiting the infiltration? The commanders told him zero infiltration may not be possible. It says minimize infiltration. What do you need for it? We needed an obstacle. So we set up at a tremendous cost, we set up the counter-infiltration fence, the anti-infiltration obstacle device, that AIOS, which helped bring down the strength of terrorists from something like 4,000, 4,500 down to about 700-800 by the time we came to 2008. So infiltration is another very, very important angle here. And one other very important aspect is this whole aspect of counter-radicalization. And not too many people in India, forget India, not too many people around the world have an idea how to do this. And this is something we could always discuss in the Q&A session. So I'll leave it at this, and I'll request our next speaker to come in, and I shall make a short 5-minute intervention in place of Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi at the end of our next speaker. The next speaker, it will be Dr. Michael Barak. Is a senior researcher and lecturer at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, Reichman University, and a scholar at the Middle of Eastern and African Study Department at Tel Aviv University. Great to have you with us and looking forward to your intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank also to Abhinav Pandya and to the wonderful team staff about on the organizing this wonderful conference. So I will speak about India and Israel and the challenge of religious extremism in comparative aspect. So Israel and India actually are two democracies that are confronted with Islamist terrorist groups and religious extremism that pose a threat to their national security and the safety of their citizens. While Al-Qaeda and ISIS view Israel and India as enemies, they must fight against in jihad. There are other Islamists who attempt to undermine the existing political system and replace it with an Islamic one by fostering a radical atmosphere through the spread of fake news and incitement on social media. So in this lecture, I would like to discuss about the threat of global jihad and Islamist in Turkey, who is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood to India. What is the threat from Turkey to the India from there, and to compare it with the threat posed to Israel. So as we know, in September 2022, India outlawed the Popular Front India, PFI, a political and social organization that draws inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas for 5 years for its links and support in terrorist groups. Similarly, in 2015, Israel outlawed the northern factions of the Islamic movement led by Raed Salah, who was affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, also for its links and support in the Palestinian terrorist organization Hamas. The two Islamic organizations maintain strong relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist activists in different countries, including Turkey. And my emphasis will be on Turkey also. We should remember that following the ascension of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, now the president of Egypt, to power in July 2013, thousands of members of the Muslim Brotherhood were forced to flee the country, seeking political refuge in countries such as Turkey, Qatar, and beyond. As a result, several Brotherhood activists were able to integrate into Turkish academic institutions, contributing to the establishment of research institutes that studied geopolitical developments in the Middle East, Far East, and also Russia. Currently, there are about 30 such research institutes that exist throughout Turkey, but many of which focus not only on academic research, but also on advocacy activities against Israel and to a lesser extent the policies of the Indian regime. Actually, they are using these research institutes also to launch a propaganda against Israel and also to criticize the Indian government policy to the Muslims. So in this context, I will mention two research institutes in Turkey that were able to cultivate relations with the PIF. The first one is the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, led by Sami al-Arian. In his past, Sami al-Arian was charged with terrorism and accused of being the US leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ. Because he was suspected of funding the PIJ, he was expelled from his office as a professor at Tampa University. After a long legal battle, a plea bargain, and house arrest, El-Arian admitted that he was affiliated with the PIJ and was deported to Turkey in February 2015. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, helped him settle in Turkey, secure a position for him at the Istanbul Zaim University. In 2017, El-Arian established the CIGA at the university and currently works as its coordinator. Sami al-Arian links with the PFI party was made evident through his role as a speaker in a webinar titled Palestine Road to Justice to Peace, which was organized by the PFI and features some of its members, including Omar Salam, the chairman of the PFI, and Muhammad Shakif, the secretary of the party. The webinar, which took place at the end of May 2021, amid heightened tensions between Israel and Hamas, saw its speakers emphasize the commitment of Indian Muslims to the Palestinian cause despite the Indian government's backing of Israel. The second research institute is the Asia Middle East Forum led by Dr. Muhammad Makaram Balawi in Istanbul. Balawi is a Jordanian national and a strong supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. In October 2022, he attended a conference with Musa Abu Marzouk, a member of the political bureau of Hamas, to discuss the potential benefits and cultivating closer ties with China to support the Palestinian in contrast to the US support in Israel. Balawi is also known to have close connections to Sami El-Arian and has promoted the El-Arian webinar with the PIF on his social media accounts. Balawi is proud of his connections to India, which he referred to as his second homeland, but he has also been known to criticize India's government in his interviews with the Arabic media, and he accused the Indian regime of being overly zealous in the promotions of Hinduism and of allegedly oppressing the Muslim population within India. It is clear that Balawi holds strong opinion on the political situation in India, and his views are sure to remain a major part of the discourse for some time to come. Now, the two institutions, the two examples that I mentioned, is a hint and give us a clue of the social network that the PIF has established with Islamists in Turkey, mainly with the Muslim Brotherhood. And through it, by exploiting this network, the PIF seeks to, by this network, these Islamists and the PIF are seeking to cultivate anti-Israeli climate within the Muslim population in India, to pressure the Indian government to cool or to sever ties with the Israeli government, and to weaken the popular support for Modi government. The activity in question may lead to the promotion of a radical ideology among Muslims in India, both in terms of their view of Israel and in terms of the Indian government. In light of this threat, both Israel and India have taken action by outlawing the northern factions of Islamic movement and the PIF, respectively. However, given the alliance between Turkey and both Israel and India, it would be beneficial for them to implore the Turkish regime to prevent any inciting activity against them that may originate within Turkish borders. And we can see that there are some webinars also in Facebook that have been uploaded to Facebook, for example, where we can see those Muslim Brotherhood from Turkey who speaks against the policy of India and against Israel. Now, moving to the second part of the lecture, I will briefly focus on the global jihad threat posed to India and Israel. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS have defined Israel and India to be their designated enemies, and have actively encouraged their followers to wage a jihad against them. In May 2022, Sheikh Ayman al-Zawahiri called Muslims to target Indians and Israelis after he highlighted the parallels, the similarities between Israel treatment policy through the Palestinians and India policy concerning Muslims in Kashmir. Also last week, ISIS published in its official weekly El-Naba an editorial article which he called to target Jews around the world and to kill them. And the Taliban was mentioned in this session. I will say that the return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan in August 2021 and the subsequent political vacuum created by the American withdrawal have raised alarm bells among India, the international community, and other stakeholders due to the potential for terrorist activities such as ISIS, Khorasan, Al-Qaeda, and its factions, AQIS, to gain a foothold in the country. This is further evidenced by the fact that Al-Qaeda leader Sheikh Ayman al-Zawahiri was found to have been hiding in the home of Siraj ad-Din al-Haqqani, one of the senior Taliban members. And in addition, there is evidence of growing ties between the Taliban and the Hamas within the Israeli context. Against the backdrop of this reality, terrorist organizations in Afghanistan are investing significant efforts in expanding their networks of financing, recruitment, training, and logistical support to enable them to allocate resources to other conflict zones, such as Kashmir. Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been utilizing social media platforms in Hindi and English to disseminate propaganda against the Indian government and Hindu population in India, in the hopes of recruiting Indian Muslims and sowing discord between Muslims and Hindus in India. For example, ISIS in January this year, ISIS in India released a magazine named Sirat al-Mustaqim, Sirat al-Mustaqim. It's a new journal in English, which disseminating his propaganda. But for now, however, the success of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in terms of recruitment and terrorism attacks against India remains very limited. The resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan, perpetrated by affiliates of the Pakistani Taliban and other Islamic groups, pose also a threat to the Indian security due to the possibility of the country's nuclear weapon falling into the hands of the terrorists. To effectively address the issue of religious extremism and Islamic terrorism, especially in the midst of economic hardship, climate change, and global uncertainty, it is necessary to establish an effective security and intelligence alliance between India, Israel, and other nations. So you need a network in order to defeat a terrorist network. That's it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Barak, thank you very much. That was very, very informative, especially this whole issue of the ISIS. I'm glad you covered it in such detail. The whole aspect of Turkey, aspects of how issues have emerged there, how Turkish space is being exploited for anti-Israel and anti-India activities. This mention of these 30 centers which are promoting thinking and advocacy against both our countries and our interests. What fascinated me particularly is your information about the ISIS in India and this aspect of the Sirat Mustaqim magazine. I am aware that yes, the ISIS has got a fairly good networks in southern India, but by and large, the Indian intelligence agencies have been able to counter this. And but your information must be very, very revealing. There's no doubt about it. With what is happening in Sri Lanka, problems of the economic problems in Sri Lanka, and the connectivity of the northern Sri Lanka, the Tamil areas with some of the areas in southern India, the potential for ISIS to function here remains very much live. And we cannot forget the 18th April 2019 very famous blasts, if you remember, which on Easter Day in Sri Lanka, which were all generally connected to what was happening in some of the parts of southern India. Thank you for drawing attention to all this, and for the very important suggestion and aspect of India and Israel working together on all aspects of counterterrorism. I may relate one small experience of my second visit to Israel when I came there a couple of years ago. I came to attend the Herzliya Counterterrorism Summit. That was the first year we were making a presentation on Kashmir in the Herzliya Summit. I may say that this was one place I expected that there would be no Pakistani present here, and we would make a very frank and very, very transparent presentation before the entire counter-terrorist community. But you will be surprised, Dr. Barak, that at the breakfast table in Tel Aviv, in the hotel I was staying, I was joined by 3 Pakistanis in the morning. And I was surprised. What are Pakistanis doing in Israel? What are they doing in the Herzliya Summit? No one could give me answers to that. And I've been relating this everywhere, that it's important to remember that Pakistan's intelligence agencies and their networks have found a place everywhere. Whether you go to Western Europe, you go to Turkey, you go to Russia, you go to Central Europe, Central Asia, and you go to Israel of all countries, you'll even find them in Israel. So this is something that we need to take cognizance of and perhaps work on to make sure that the Pakistani narrative is not given its place, is not given its due when it is against the interests of both India and Israel. So, with that, I'm just told that Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi has also joined. He's back from a foreign visit. He was abroad and he's joined in. And like any good, very good senior government officer, he has made sure that he has lived up to his commitment and he wishes to speak now, immediately after Dr. Barak. So I'm really looking forward to this intervention because probably he will give us some of the aspects of his thinking at the official level as to how India is looking at the future in terms of its counterterrorism policies. So over to you,
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi. Thank you. We're looking forward to your intervention.
Thank you very much, sir. My apologies, I've been a bit late in joining. I was traveling abroad and just come back and just reached office a few minutes back. But I have heard, in fact, a couple of the points which have been made by esteemed speakers earlier, and they are quite relevant in terms of the challenges which we are facing on counter-terror front. I would just attempt to give what we are doing on a diplomatic front, basically. I'm not going into the details of what are the challenges which we have, but my efforts would be only confined to what we have been doing in this context in the last couple of years and recently. We have been, as you know, that we have been trying to be at the front of any counter-terror efforts globally, in fact. And in this context, we have made sure that we are in the leadership positions on important bodies, particularly at the UN level. In 2022, we were the chair of the Counterterrorism Committee. We hosted here in India a very significant conference highlighting the importance of the challenges, particularly on the new and emerging technologies which we are facing. And I think that is something which we all need to factor in while devising our counter-terror strategies in future, because they are going to be the challenge in future. Especially if you look at drones, I think Mr. Pandya talked about how drones are being used to ferry across the border various kind of equipments, arms, ammunitions, drugs, fake Indian currencies. I think that's something which we all need to think about and see what we can do together. Another, I think, is very important challenge which have been highlighted also is how to counter the misuse of internet, particularly not only in terms of radicalization, in terms of spreading the radical content online and trying to radicalize impressionable minds, young people. And that is why I think it's very important that we continue to focus on the ways and means and continue to engage with not only at the government level, but also at the service providers level. That is also a very important aspect of, any government, should be an important aspect of any governmental effort. And I think some of these companies also have, the service providers themselves have also come forward and trying to take some action on this. I recall one particular organization which they have formed that is called GIFCT, Global Internet Forum Against Countering Terrorism. They are doing good work, but there's more to be done, and we need to all push for that they take responsibility to delete all the contents, not to spread or not to allow their social media platforms to spread counter-terror terror contents and radicalization contents online. So that's an important aspect of it. We also need to focus on the other aspects of this particular new and emerging technologies which have been used in financing of terrorism, particularly the cryptocurrencies, the use of virtual assets. I think these are some of the issues which we need to really look into in terms of countering terror and terror financing in future. And these were some of the aspects which were highlighted during the counter-terrorism committee special meeting which was held in Delhi in October 2022. A New Delhi declaration was issued thereafter which contained all these elements, and I think that has become a pioneering document for the international community to focus on and build on that, how we go forward in these efforts. at the same time, India has also hosted recently a very important conference, which is called No Money for Terror Conference. And that was primarily, again, focused on countering terror financing. Terror financing is something which is, I think, is very important if we really need to look at this problem holistically. We need to look at ways and means to counter terror financing, especially in the domain of not only the traditional way of financing, but also the new and emerging ways of financing. And I think No Money for Terror conference provided the context in this regard. And Honorable Prime Minister spoke in that conference. He also highlighted a zero tolerance approach towards terrorism and terror financing. I think we need to look all these aspects very carefully if we really need to form a counter-terror strategy in future. Apart from that, what India does is basically we have formed a joint working group on counter-terrorism with all the important countries of the world. Right now, we have 27 joint working group with different countries, which includes all the important countries, including US, UK, Germany, France. On Southeast Asia, we have with Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. We have with other countries in the Gulf. We have with Saudi Arabia. So we have a joint working group on counterterrorism with almost all important countries dealing or facing this issue. So this is something which we do on a regular basis. These meetings are held on a regular basis. Interagency delegations participate in these meetings, and we try and make sure that all the issues which are there are discussed during these meetings, particularly on sharing of assessments, on discussing about the new and emerging technology, new and emerging challenges on counter-radicalization and counter-terrorism front. All these issues are discussed. Capacity building is another aspect. I think that's very, very important, and we have been quite active in that too. Our National Security Guard, our other agencies, also, for example, NIA, the Bureau of Police Research and Development Organization, they have been carrying out a lot of training programs, a lot of capacity building programs to build capacities on countering terrorism and terror financing, radicalization, and other related aspects. So there has been a lot of efforts in terms of countering terrorism at our level, particularly in the diplomatic domain. We have also been active in organizations like FATF, Financial Action Task Force, where our delegation regularly participates in that. And that is also, I think FATF is an organization which works very diligently and very effectively in terms of countering terrorism, because the system which they have is of peer review or mutual evaluation, as they call it. And that is a system whereby a group of experts, they evaluate the lacunas in the systems at the systematic level and also at the implementation level. So I think that becomes a very important tool in terms of countering terrorism at the international level. We have also been participating in SCO REDS, the Singhvi Cooperation Organization Regional Structure Against Terrorism. We have been, we remain chair of the SCO REDS for 2022. Has been recently handed over to Kazakhstan. In that also, we have tried and worked on some of these aspects that we try and do something which is useful for the international community. I think we cannot fight this problem or this menace unless we have a collaborative and a cooperative approach towards this. And we need to certainly look at international collaborations more closely, and every country has to work on that. If you really need to counter, because nowadays the situation is that the problem is somewhere, the conspiracies are hatched at another place, the financing comes from other place, and the fighters travel from other place. So I think these are some of the issues which different countries are facing. So I think there is certainly a need to further build on and further strengthen not only the information sharing, but also capacity building, sharing of best practices and all that. We, as Government of India, we have also been participating in a organization which is working on the normative front, which is called Global Counterterrorism Forum, GCTF. And that's also an important forum. We have been working on various aspects of that. They have come out with various memoranda of good practices, and that is, I think, certainly the documents which can be looked at in terms of building future strategies in this context. So there are various things. We also have taken efforts in the context of listing of certain terrorists. And as you all know that recently we have had a success in terms of designations of Abdul Rahman Makki in the UN. There are other proposals also pending. And we hope that these proposals would be looked at objectively by the countries and they would not be obstructed just for some other regions. They need to be looked at very objectively, and every country should make it sure that terrorists are terrorists anywhere, and that they should be treated like that, and that needs to be borne in mind by all the countries. We have also been designating terrorists now in India. In 2019, the UAPA Act was amended, and we now have almost more than 50 individuals who have been listed here. So that's again a very important tool to counter terrorism and terror financing in India. We have recently also hosted a meeting of the BIMSTEC Joint Working Group on Counterterrorism in India. And that is, again, I think, an area where we can certainly look at this. BIMSTEC includes countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Bhutan, Nepal. So we have been trying to work on this aspect. BIMSTEC has recently, I think in the last couple of years, have achieved good success in terms of having a convention on countering terrorism and transnational crimes. Recently, a convention on mutual legal assistance in criminal matter was also signed, and that is waiting for ratification by the member states. But all these things would provide certainly valuable tools in terms of forging international cooperation, seeking international cooperation, and providing international cooperation to counter terrorism. So I think I would stop at that. We have been working on many fronts. I would not like to go into the details of all these things, but I can assure you that we are working very effectively, very diligently on all these fronts, and our work would continue to be there. The Government of India would continue to work with like-minded countries for countering terrorism. Thank you, sir.
Singhvi sir, thank you very much for that excellent intervention by you. I'm not sure if you're suffering from jet lag, but it doesn't seem to be at all. After your travel, you seem to be having all your faculties very much alive. Thank you very much for that. Now we've got enough time with us, so we have two things. Number one, I'm going to request Mr. Michael Rubin once again because he's communicated with me and he would like to make one or two points on Afghanistan, so I'm going to request him for that. Before that, one or two issues as a comment on what Mr. Singhvi has just said, if I may just bring it out. Number one, remember, gone are the days when we felt that counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency were only to be handled through the kinetic route. Lots and lots of things which you are bringing out here at the moment are obviously all a part of counter-terrorism, and they balance out the kinetic. The kinetic is so important, but at the same time, they balance it out. It's mitigation that we are virtually doing. It is like in disaster management, it's a question of first mitigating and preparing yourself so that you don't have to ultimately respond at all. That is exactly what everyone is looking at today in the world of counterterrorism. Secondly, I'm not sure. This is something which I love to speak about in most of seminars and meetings. I'm not sure how many people are aware of the Singapore model. The Singapore model of counter-radicalization. So I'll just take a minute to explain to you. I've written on this very often. I find Singapore is one of the countries which anticipated that after 9/11, it could be also hit. It could be Dubai, it could be Hong Kong, it could be Singapore, a major nerve center, financial nerve center could be hit. And it's got a 15% Muslim population, not to say that Muslims are terrorists, but saying that 50% Muslim population, the potential of some radicals making their way into it. So to offset this whole thing and prepare themselves, the Singapore government took it upon itself to create its own model. Besides many things that they did, like addressing all the prison houses, all the schools, colleges, and universities, all the labor camps where people work hard during the day, come back in the evening, and do not have the means of entertainment, etc. And their entertainment is listening to some ideologues, someone walking by, coming and addressing them. That is how minds change. And the Singapore government made sure that it prevented this, avoided this. But the most important experiment they did, which is very, very successful till today, is this aspect of what is called the internet imam, which meant that while the internet is being used by the terrorists and by the ideologues to convert young minds, etc., the governments can also use the internet equally to counter it. So they created a set of four members of the clergy in the beginning. Today, there are 75 members of the clergy who are all very well educated in the tenets of Islam and different other religions, networked, they are technically savvy. And if anyone has questions, and this is advertised to people, to young people in schools and colleges, if anyone is going to doubt, if anyone is suffering from the influence of radical thinking and wants to rationalize, he can go back to any of these imams. And these imams then give out a pluralistic, a middle path kind of a interpretation which is not being otherwise given to these young people. And through this, well, Singapore has kept itself safe. And I hope many other countries can emulate this example, because people are looking for ways and means of how to do counter-radicalization. And it's not just a question of getting 50 young people, 100 young people in a madrasa. It's a question of how to do this on a mass scale. That's the most important way to do it, and that's the way where you will find your success. So I'll stop there, and I will hand over to Mr. Michael Rubin. I may like to take 5-7 minutes to talk about Afghanistan in particular, the spaces in Afghanistan which are existing, the gravitation of terrorist groups into those areas, and what do you assess and what do you think is the future of these groups?
General, thank you for handing the floor back over to me. Actually, what your comments had earlier triggered me want to speak a little bit more about Afghanistan, a country which I've had the privilege to go forth to, both in areas controlled by the Afghan government and before 9/11, in areas controlled by the Taliban. What you actually said that caused me to react is that America wouldn't allow Pakistan to collapse, even though we did that with Afghanistan. And on one hand, of course, the United States, every so often it's reported in the news how we have some sort of scenario in place in order to try to secure Pakistan's nuclear weapons should the country collapse. But what I'm worried about is a combination of what I saw in Afghanistan versus alongside the atmosphere which I see when I'm in Pindi or when I'm in Islamabad. Specifically with regard to Afghanistan, without any doubt, if our presence in the last 5 years of our Afghanistan experience was not much more expensive than our presence in Korea or Japan. And I live in Bethesda, Maryland. We suffered fewer casualties in combat in Afghanistan than we have car accidents in Bethesda, Maryland. We had found that golden spot, but this rhetoric of ending forever wars, really from a military standpoint, was an attack on the traditional nature of deterrence. That said, what we've done in Afghanistan has left a tremendous vacuum. When I first went into Afghanistan, into the Taliban portion of Afghanistan in 2000, March of 2000, I was conducting interviews. And what many people said is we had initially in Kabul, in Jalalabad, in Kandahar, is we had originally welcomed the Taliban because they promised stability, and the existing government, the warlords, weren't abiding by our security, but within just a couple years, a couple months, if not a couple years, we learned that our security wasn't guaranteed by the Taliban. They were just as bad as the warlords were. The Taliban are very good at preaching what they're against. They're far less good at actually governing. The other misconception the United States has, and this contributes to the danger which Afghanistan poses, is it's all well and good in the State Department or in Zalmay Khalilzad's mind to suggest that, you know, the Taliban can disassociate themselves from Al Qaeda, from the Islamic State, Khorasan, or whatever group you want to talk about. But in reality, what you're talking about is cousin disassociating themselves from cousin, brother from brother. It simply isn't realistic. It never was, which is why the Taliban never kept that agreement, where before the final US withdrawal, we or the Afghan forces had killed 2 leaders of Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent at a time when the Taliban said that they were no longer sponsoring terrorism. What worries me, however, is the impact this could have on Pakistan. There's always been a self-delusion in Pakistan. You can trace the Pakistani embrace, the ISI's embrace of extremism, either to Zia al-Haq or to the loss of Bangladesh. In either case, Pakistani thought leaders believed that they could operationalize religious extremism to paper over the ethnic divisions inside Afghanistan. The loss of Bangladesh, of course, made this, the loss of East Pakistan, I should say, made this a existential threat. What we saw going on in Pashtunistan, in the Northwest Frontier Province, was no longer an irritant. It was something that could strike at the heart of the Pakistani state. The same thing is true with regard to Baluchistan. What I worry about is every time we've seen a country try to operationalize this religious extremism, they invariably lose control. We saw it with regard to Saudi Arabia. We saw it with regard to Syria. I would argue that Turkey, and I've greatly enjoyed Michael Barak's presentation, I would argue that Turkey in the 21st century will in many ways be what Saudi Arabia was in the 20th century with regard to the spread of extremism. Now, when I'm in Islamabad, I don't know how many of the people in the audience have had the opportunity to go to Islamabad, but it's an artificial city. It's a garden city. It's an oasis inside Afghanistan. And when I'll meet with people from the ISI or others in the Islamabad club, this country club in the heart of Islamabad, it's like an oasis within an oasis. When you're sitting in that club drinking your whiskey, you can believe that the extremism isn't really a problem, that the elites are going to be able to maintain the control which they've always had. But in 2006, we saw the Malakand Accords where the Pakistanis almost lost control, where you got the Tehrik Talabani Pakistan marching to within 60 kilometers of Islamabad, I believe it was. In Karachi, you can no longer walk the streets because it has basically become the domain of the Islamists. The elites in Pakistan remain in their own bubble. I don't truly believe they realize fully, put the ISI aside, the diplomatic elites, the political elites, just how vulnerable their society is right now. You, General, had said that the United States wouldn't allow Pakistan to collapse. Unfortunately, while I'm not sure, given the mood in Washington right now, that we're going to do much about it, we tend to make messes and let people in the region clean them up for us. At the same time, I'm afraid that thesis, if you will, is going to be tested a lot sooner than many people would like to believe.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Absolutely. Thank you very much for giving us this full analysis. And at the end of it, I do believe, I tend to agree with you. And when I look back and see that the United States allowed Afghanistan to actually implode, virtually on 31st of August, walked away from Afghanistan, left behind 6 lakh weapons and everything else there, and decided that it could take care of itself, or if the worst case, the Pakistan could take care of it. And tomorrow this could very well happen to Pakistan. And if that happens, the assumption I suppose the United States will make is that India could look after it. I suppose that will be the most dangerous assumption to make. Anyway, but that was a very, very interesting analogy that you brought out. Thank you very much for it. I will add only at the end of it, for us to understand the degree of radicalization in Pakistan, you have to just remember the name Mumtaz Qadri. Remember the name Mumtaz Qadri, the man who assassinated Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab, and became a hero overnight. A mausoleum was constructed over his body after he was hung to death by the state of Pakistan. I mean, these are the kind of predictions that you find within Pakistan itself. So thank you. I mean, this is an eye-opener, absolutely an excellent reminder to all of us that Pakistan, you have to keep your eyes hawk-like all the time to make sure you pick up the nuances, because otherwise we can be hit back very, very badly. Thank you for that. We've got about, I would say about 20 minutes, and we can take in some questions. If there's anyone wishing to ask a question, please open your video, come on to it. If you wish, you can type it out. There is a question already, one here, but it's a very simple question, that one. The question, while anyone else is thinking about coming on, is from Hardik Khandelwal. Is he here? Would you like to ask it? How effective is economic development to fight radicalization? Where is Hardik Khandelwal? Yeah. Come. Open your video. Why are you hiding behind your camera? Unmute yourself. Yeah. Come. You have a question? Who would you like to address it to?
Yes, sir. So, to the IFS officer, Mahaveer, sir. Sir, you said about counter radicalism. So, how is economic development effective in counter radical operations or counter radicalism?
Counter radicalization.
Counter radicalization.
How is the question, to frame it correctly, would be, what is the role of economic development in the fighting of counter radicalization? Please keep yourself, bring on your video. Don't switch off it. You are. It's a discourteous thing if you're asking a question. You must keep your video on. Now you're asking this question from Mr. Singhvi. May I request Mr. Mahaveer Singhvi to please respond? Continue remaining there, Mr. Khandelwal.
Thank you, sir. I think
Yes,
economic development certainly plays an important role in countering radicalization. But radicalization is a very complex problem. There are various aspects to it. And I think it needs to be addressed comprehensively. I'm sure Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain would be in a better position to give this answer, because he has dealt with this issue at the front. So I think perhaps I would request you, sir, to go into this. But certainly economic development plays a role. We have been doing a lot of economic development work where we see the government of India.
Would Abhinav like to come in, because he's raised his hand? Would you like to come in on this question itself, or do you have a different question?
This question, sir, this economic development. This is a very interesting question, Hardik, actually, and you can always find multiple answers to this. But I can share from.
There cannot be a simple solution to it just by economic development. It cannot be, because we look at the people getting radicalized over years. You will see that those who are economically well developed, in the sense having high income, well educated, even graduates, engineers, doctors, they have been radicalized. So there is no certain criteria as such how people get radicalized. It can be your personal experience. It can be through maybe through a peer pressure or a peer exposure to radicalism, and it may be also through various ideologies which are circulating on the internet. So it depends how a man gets radicalized. It's a completely different kind of questions, because I think a lot of aspects need to be put together to actually study how radicalization happens, and the pill to counter this also has to be tailored accordingly. So there has to be various ways to counter it. One certain aspect cannot deal with it, and there has to be a comprehensive approach. And Government of India focuses on a comprehensive approach on countering radicalization.
Yes, Abhinav.
Thank you, sir. I would agree with Mahaveer Singhvi ji regarding this. Okay, radicalization in itself is a very complex process, and I can share a few things from my experience. Like in Kashmir, if we see, most of the people who are the intellectual backbones of this terrorism and separatism, the Jamaat-e-Islami ideologues and all, they are all from, they are not from the poor background actually. They are from good, rich background. If you see the intellectual ideologues. And the militants who are actually dying in the operations, the militants who are getting killed, they are from, I would say, lower middle class or middle class background. Even recently, Mannan Wani, like Burhan Wani's brother, Mannan Wani was a PhD student. He was doing his PhD. So, I mean, we cannot call him a poor man. Even in Sri Lanka, those Easter bombing case, those guys came from rich families. Okay. In Kerala, when we see radicalization, most of the people who are coming back from the Gulf or who have that experience from the Middle Eastern world, they are getting radicalized and they are not particularly poor. They are quite rich actually. And on the other hand, like in my state, if I tell you, so we have people who are following the Barelvi segment, and they are the local Muslims here. They've mingled well with the local population, and you can find them visiting temples also, and they are okay. But the new wave of the Wahhabi, ideological influences and the Deobandi influences, that is coming to the people who are slightly from the better off sections of the society. So, I mean, and even that fellow Omar Sheikh, if you remember, this guy who was released with Masood Azhar, he was a student of London School of Economics. He came from a very good background. So, I mean, I really disagree that, that economic development can be a panacea for solving the problem of radicalization. In European context, if you see, there are different models. The prison radicalization is very prominent in Europe. In countries like Sweden, Belgium, prison radicalization has become a major cause for radicalization. Even in Kashmir, the prison, this is a major center. In fact, it used to be said that if you have to know the headquarters of how the terror machinery is being run in the state, then you go to the prison. That is one factor. In France, especially when if you refer to the Professor Olivier Roy's research, then you find that the second generation Muslims, who, I mean, their parents came from countries like Morocco, Algeria, they kind of followed their old traditional Islam, but the second generation Muslims who initially tried to mingle into the society, they became westernized. They had girlfriends. Some of them were homosexuals. They got into drugs. But then later, when they faced breakups in their relationships, when they faced employment issues, and then they got into drugs and into petty crimes, then they were in a very vulnerable state of mind. Then some ISIS recruiter kind of spotted them and told them that, well, all your problems will be solved if you get yourself into this jihad. And whatever you have done in the past, all sins will be completely redeemed if you become a jihadi. And you can keep doing your sins, you can keep womanizing, you can keep getting into drugs, but if you do jihad at the same time, that okay, these sins won't be counted. So that is the different factors.
And on top
I would strongly recommend, before I come to Dr. Michael Barak, who I'm sure will explain us the context of the Palestinian territories, in particular in terms of dealing with them from the development angle. Let me just make one or two points. I think if anyone in our audience today or among the panelists, anyone really wants to understand this whole issue, see a Pakistani film, not an Indian film, a Pakistani film called Khuda Ke Liye. Khuda Ke Liye. See it. It's an outstanding film. It's on the internet. And it will explain you an ideal model of how a young modern Pakistani boy, fond of his guitar, singing Western music, Western songs and things like that, starts getting radicalized. How he comes close to a particular cleric. And how over a period of time his mind is changed. His actions can be interpreted. For example, just at a meal time, getting up from his chair and going and putting a veil on his mother's head. All these years, he had never found his mother to be not acceptable to him from a religious angle. But suddenly, the moment he starts getting radicalized, he wants his mother to look an ideal Muslim in his perception. It's a beautiful film, understand it, because it will give you many ideas of countering. So therefore, if I may suggest to you, counter a narrative. Remember, the ISIS has 40,000 fighters who came to Iraq, northern Iraq, and Syria. Out of them, all these guys weren't really famished, impoverished people. Many of them were from rich families. Many of them had lots of money at home. Many of them had left their jobs. They were professionals. Suddenly, out of the blue, something emerged to them. Something appealed to them. This is what psychologists need to look at more deeply. Not enough study has been done on this yet. But those are the issues which will have to be addressed. Nihilism. Some of the scholars call it that it is nihilism which ultimately leads to this kind of an approach and attitude in the form in the transformation of an individual to become a terrorist. And therefore, you need to use something of that nature to counter it. So, example. Family involvement, dignity, the restoration of dignity. You may do all kinds of ideological things, but at the end of the day, if a family feels that its dignity has been compromised, it may even lead to the extent of it supporting a particular child, a boy or a girl or anyone. But if you really want to counter it, alongside your development and all these activities which you are doing, look at how to ensure that these people get their dignity restored to them. And that is another route towards counter-radicalization. One can go on this, but I look forward to Dr. Michael Barak's opinion on this. If you can spend 2-3 minutes to just explain us, please.
I will make it very briefly. I agree with all of you. In very short, the key point in order to counter radicalization is education, as was also written, not only economic, because if we take the Palestinian matter or also Arab Israelis who were radicalized and their background was from rich family, these Arab Israelis were identified with ISIS by being exposed to social media propaganda. It doesn't matter now if you are rich for family or not. The important thing is also the culture. You know that, for example, in among the Arab Israelis and also Palestinians, holding a gun, to hold a gun is a symbol of manhood, of you are a man, macho. Okay, so we just heard that 3 weeks ago a young boy, 13 years old, shot to death in east of Jerusalem, on Jewish people, because it was custom in the Arab society in Israel to hold the gun. So the culture is very important, and when you have education and social media networks propaganda, and you are exposed to this kind of atmosphere, so you can easily become radicalized. So it doesn't matter now if you're from rich family or not. Education, I think, is the most important thing. And unfortunately, in the schools in East Jerusalem, for example, there are teachers that incite against Israel. Some of them are identified with the Palestinian Authority, and some of them are identified with Hamas. And this is a big problem that Israel has to cope. Let's see what will be now with the new government. But again, education. This is, by the way, also in Egypt. Al-Azhar, religious establishment, is trying to cope with the young people in Egypt, to preach in the mosque, also in the curriculum, in the education system, to speak in those young people that ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't represent, and the Muslim Brotherhood also don't represent the true Islam. And that's right. That is why the Al-Azhar is trying to cultivate ties with the other faiths and also with the Vatican, in order to show that the Islam can coexist with other faiths. Education, it begins with education. I think that religious authorities like Al-Azhar can play a very major role in fighting against extremism. Of course, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other dissident Islamist actors can present Al-Azhar and those religious authorities as a puppets of the authorities and not reliable. But again, it's a fight. It's a counter narrative. It's a fight between narratives.
Thank you. I entirely agree with you. I mean, there can be no doubt about it. Education is such an important aspect. If I may add a line here from experience of being a Muslim myself, I can tell you this, that in South Asia, I'm not sure if this happens in the Middle East, but in South Asia, it is traditional, Pakistan, India, Northern India in particular, is traditional that Muslim families like to have their children, besides studying in a good convent school or a government school or something like that, they do like to have their children educated for an hour or so in terms of the Quran. So they like to get a cleric home, afternoon 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, for some education on the Quran, because they feel this is a practice which is necessary as a good believing Muslim. Now, you leave your child in the hands of a cleric who you do not know anything about. What he is teaching your children, what ideas he is infusing in the minds of your children, you do not know. So it's very important many times that people, Muslims who have this, and there's nothing wrong with it, to understand your own religious book, but make sure that people you call to your house to educate your children do not infuse the wrong ideas and thinking into the minds of the people. And I've taken this as a cue from what Dr. Barak just said, education. Education is such an important aspect here. It can be misused also to a great extent. Thank you for that. We've run through the whole lot, but we've got a hand up. I'm not sure, Ambika Bhargav, would you like to comment on this subject, or would you like to ask a fresh question? Ambika Bhargav, if you can unmute and put on your video, it'll be good for us to all see you and hear you. Ambika, yeah, good.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I wanted to ask another question.
Yeah, go ahead, ask that question. No problem.
It's about like my personal observation about the radicalization of young women in India. As contrary to the situation in Afghanistan, like what we see is like since 508 days, the high school education is being banned for girls in Afghanistan, and there are 52 days of university being barred from entry of female students. So the situation over there under Sharia as imposed by Taliban is so different, and here in India we can find young girls moving towards that kind of mindset. So is there anything which can be done to de-radicalize those young Muslim women in India and the youngsters in general?
Who would like to answer? Who are you addressing this question to?
Anyone?
No, you tell me. You have asked this question. You must have identified in your mind who's the best person to answer this question.
Actually, that was actually I framed the question differently earlier when even Lakshmi ma'am was there, because it was about the condition of women.
Well, your question relates to Afghanistan and to India. I would request Abhinav to answer the India part, and I would request Mr. Michael Rubin to answer the Afghanistan part. Yes, Abhinav, you can come in first.
Thank you, sir. Well, she has raised a very important point of the radicalization of women. Ambika, I must tell you from the Kashmir experience. So in Kashmir, when we see that when the militants were killed, in the encounters, they had huge funerals, and their mothers used to be treated and worshipped as like some kind of a demi-goddess figure, like they are the real heroes, and that gave a lot of prestige. So even like before the encounter, sometimes these militants call their parents, and if you listen to the conversations they have there with their mothers, initially they would say, well, why did you choose this path, this, that, but then after a while they would say, please, do your best, go and die for Jannat, go and just kill the Kafirs, and you have to do your best in jihad. So this is something which is if you target the females of the society, then you are able to create a very strong, the sentiment for radicalization, okay? And especially the generation, because it gets legitimacy at a social level, and the institutions are, are supporting you. In the recent, in this Pulwama Fidain attack, if you look at the chart sheet, then you will find that initially, Omar Farooq, who was the mastermind behind the Pulwama, he had recruited, he wanted to send Insha Jan, the girl who was the local OGW and who was supposedly his girlfriend also. So he wanted to send her as a suicide bomber. Okay. So initially she kind of agreed, but then she was reluctant. Then she identified another female, who was her friend. She was, he approached her also to join as a suicide bomber. Both these girls were radicalized. How? Because this fellow Omar Farooq narrated them stories of how females were joining jihad in Syria, and how females were joining jihad in Palestine. We just narrated all those stories. And these girls were not poor. They came from a good background. They were educated. They wore good clothes, fashionable clothes. So purely, I would say a very strong ideological angle, making its role here. And I guess, I think we should focus when you're dealing with a particular kind of terrorism. I guess we should focus more on the strategy, tactics, and the ideological part. The whole idea behind radicalizing females is that you make radicalization as an acceptable phenomenon in the family, and it's very easier to create the generation of young boys who are radicalized and send them to militancy.
If I may request Mr. Michael Rubin to also make his
After this,
in a minute or two.
Just actually, after Ambassador Trigunath has to leave for a meeting at 1:30, so just after Dr. Rubin, if we can invite him for the closing remarks.
Yeah, I've seen your remarks on the chat box.
I'll be very brief then. Number one, I would say that the Taliban narrative isn't compelling. Both prior to 2001, between 1994 and 1996, when they took Kabul, and 2001, they didn't necessarily radicalize women. Women came to resent them. I'd argue that one big variable we need to pay attention to is changing attitudes in Iran. While the protest movement is starting to lose steam in Iran, at the same time, the government isn't cracking down on the women in some of the ways they did. And of course, while Iran is Shiite, and aside from the Hazaras, Afghanistan is not, culturally, there's still a great deal of interplay between the two. When I used to teach for the US military, the way I would liken this is in understanding how Taliban attitudes differ within the country. I'm going to give an American analogy here. If you want to understand the Taliban and their attitude towards Kabul or Herat or other big cities, imagine that folks from the backwoods of West Virginia take over Berkeley, California. There's an element of anti-cosmopolitanist, anti-urbanism, almost like a Khmer Rouge type attitude. So when I would be in Afghanistan in Taliban-controlled areas, while there would be crackdowns in the cities, you'd still see women working in the fields. And so you have that sort of urban-rural dichotomy, which I think needs to be taken into account. But you asked, we talked about India, we talked about Afghanistan. I just want to give one quick example from Iraq. I go to Iraq every few months. I'm going this month, I'm going next month, and so forth. Lots of Iraqi friends have been going for 20 plus years. When I talk to Iraqis my age who have 13, 14-year-old daughters, oftentimes they're aghast when their daughters come back and suddenly they're wearing headscarf, veil, what have you. And then when I'm talking to their fathers don't know what to do because they don't want their girls to turn into, as they say, my little Talibans. But at the same time, they're afraid that if they tell the girls they can't do this, then there's going to be the normal teenage rebellion. What they actually blame is the peer pressure that occurs within the schools. That wouldn't obviously be an issue in Afghanistan today since girls are forbidden from going to school. But more broadly, one of the questions you have to deal with is the compulsion which exists in forcing girls to take a much more conservative dress in school from their peers. And this is where the whole debate was more complex than it was in Turkey, than it was portrayed in the United States with regard to the quote unquote right to wear a headscarf. You're going to have compulsion either way. The question is which side of the scale you put your finger on.
Thank you very much, Michael Rubin, sir, for your intervention. Absolutely correct. I can assure you, in India, we also have a major problem in most of the official towns, the restricted urban areas where Muslim clusters exist, and many times you'll find that a family will insist on their children abiding by these rules, and then this word spreads. And it's because your neighbor is doing something, you are forced to do that yourself. It's very, very difficult. You have to find ways of how to reach out and how to have greater kind of contact and connection between different communities. If you are participating in the actions of our different communities. I, as a young Muslim, I remember, I studied in a Christian school, and since my father was from the army, so I went to the temple every second day, and I would be very comfortable in a Sikh Gurdwara. This kind of an education doesn't come every day to everyone, and people living in clusters have a particular challenge for them. So it's not an easy issue. This is an issue which needs a much, much greater debate. Thank you very much. And since we have the time challenge on our hands, may I request Ambassador Trigunath to come in for his closing remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, General Hasnain. It has been really fascinating to listen to all the friends here on the panel. Fortunately, the Usanas Foundation has been focusing mostly on these issues of terrorism, counterterrorism, radicalization, de-radicalization. And what we have heard from each one of you is that it is a very complex process. But at the end of the day, one has to also see, because it has been also imbued by the geopolitics of it. We have seen how Taliban was brought into picture. What are the results? What happened to the invasion of Iraq? That became a fountainhead for the extremism and terrorism to continue in the Middle East, and it is continuing. So that is, of course, a past event, but the past events cloud your future. That also happens. As far as India and Pakistan is concerned, over 4 decades, we have been suffering from this cross-border terrorism. But a non-NATO ally has been allowed to continue with impunity as far as their complicity in using the terrorism as an instrument of the foreign policy is concerned. No one cares. There is FATF, then again you find ways to get them out. There is a known thing, and now China supports them in blacklisting, from blacklisting these at the UN Security Council committees. So as long as we are going to have this attitude of my terrorist, your terrorist, or good terrorist and bad terrorist, I think that zero tolerance policy is merely to remain on paper. Who's going to implement it at the end of the day? If there is no global solidarity or agreement on certain ideas, we know that the ISIS used the latest technologies to the fullest, better than the governments which were doing it. So they use it much better. They were able to radicalize a large number of people, recruiting from all over. The person who was doing their IT business was a guy from UK who was in charge. So I think that this is, and there was a question about economic development and all. Now one has to see that 9/11 was not done by poor people. They were all rich. They were well educated in London School of Economics and here and there. So it has become a business. It's a factory. Several years ago, I had read a report which was from the United States, that there is some kind of a syndicate. All these terror groups are actually connected in one way or the other. So you stop them in one end, the other side opens up and they try to, I'm not talking only about Islamic radicalists. There are IRA, there was this LTT, whether all kinds of terrorist groups they have been diffused at the moment because of the attack on the ISIS to some extent, but it is reviving very fast, as was mentioned by each one of you. So it has to be a grassroots activity, in my view. I can just tell you a small story about Indian mythology, in which, and I keep telling my Pakistani friends this more often than there was a demon called Bhasmasur. he went to Lord Shiva and prayed for him for several years. And Lord Shiva was known that anybody who prays for him, he just blindly gives the whatever benediction the fellow is asking. So he said, okay, I'm happy with you. Now you ask me what you want. So he said, you give me the boon that if I place my hand on somebody's head, that person will burn to ashes. So he said, Tathastu, yes, this will be done. And this fellow said, now let me try it on you, whether it works or not. So when Pakistan says that they are suffering from the terrorism or themselves or TTP is attacking them or they are their baby boys. They are the ones who have cultivated them and cultivated them in connivance, unfortunately, with the Western outfits. It's not something, it is a known fact. Everybody knows about it. So I think that when we are talking about this, we need to be extremely careful, cautious, honest with ourselves, and then come up with a strategy. Ambassador Singhvi mentioned about umpteen number of these groups. We discuss. Everybody knows what is the problem. We knows where this is coming from. MOUs, discussions. But actual thing lies in the implementation of it. And that's where it happens. And it has to be a comprehensive process. Schools, madrasas, religious teachers, interfaith dialogues. Now, the governments cannot be accusing A and B and saying that there will be no terrorism. They have to be taken into confidence. So until and unless we have the preachers. I was in Jordan, and I know that the king is an extremely moderate and is a man message and all, but their intelligence was monitoring each and every mosque. And they took them into confidence, despite the fact they had Zarqawi, who was creating this kind of ISIS and all, the father of ISIS at one time. So I think that we need to be mindful of this, that there will always be difference, but we can minimize that to as much as possible through this. But it was educating for me also. And just recently, yesterday, in fact, Ambassador Arvind Gupta had inaugurated this book, which Abhinav has brought out with the various, I would say, contributions by scholars, students, researchers on terrorism. And that would make a very good reading and perhaps comes up with good suggestions. So as they say, inshallah, we will be able to overcome it at some point of time. But the basic humanity and human decency is necessary, and tolerance for the other. Thank you once again for giving me a few minutes.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. So finally, we come to the end of this two-day online conference, online part of the Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue 2023. But this is not the end of it. Soon we'll have the offline part in Udaipur from March 23rd to 25th, and we'll be dealing with the other aspects of geopolitics, foreign policy, economic development, and security issues which are relevant to finding India's role in the changing world order. We look forward to that, and the registrations for the offline conference are open. Please, anyway, if anyone wants to join us here in Udaipur, please register. And once again, it's a beautiful city, so it will be a very different experience. So after the end of this online conference, I would like to thank all the esteemed delegates and participants. I would like to thank Dr. Michael Rubin for joining us at this late hour. We are really humbled. You've always been a great support to Usanas Foundation. I would like to thank Ambassador Singhvi, who joined us today after such a tiring and a hectic tour. And I would like to thank the other participants, Dalia, Mr. Salman Al-Ansari, and the participants who joined us yesterday. I would like to give a special thanks to session chairpersons, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, General Hasnain, Ambassador Sajan Har, Dr. Shriparna Pathak. Then my special regards for the keynote speakers, Dr. Arvind Gupta and Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, who joined us today. Finally, my thanks to the MPAGD Secretariat, the members of the MPAGD Conference Secretariat, Ambassador Trigunayat, Arun Anandji, Dr. Anita Jain, Preeti and Shweta, and also my very warm regards to the background team of Usanas Foundation, all the interns who have played a very important role in making this conference a big success. And thanks to all the participants who registered and who joined us for this interesting conference. Looking forward to more of your participation in our future events. And thank you very much. And also thanks to the Ministry of External Affairs, which is they are a co-host in this event. They are supporting us. My warmest thanks and regards to them. Thank you very much. Namaskar.